I want to share with you a protocol that fundamentally changed how I think about evening inflammation and recovery. What we know from the literature is that around 10 p.m., your body undergoes what I call a biological pivot point. This is when cortisol, your primary stress hormone, should be reaching its nadir, its lowest point of the day. And so, what's happening at this specific time window is a crossover between your stress physiology and your inflammatory tone. When cortisol fails to decline properly, inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein can remain elevated through the night, disrupting the deep recovery your tissues need. Now, the first step in this protocol is what I call magnesium staggering. And here's why that matters. Magnesium glycinate, when taken in a staggered dose, meaning you're splitting your intake across the evening rather than taking it all at once, aligns absorption with this 10 p.m. window. The key thing to understand is that magnesium glycinate has very high bioavailability, meaning your body can actually use it. What's fascinating here is that magnesium glycinate specifically supports GABAergic tone in your brain. GABA is your primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, and when magnesium enhances GABA receptor function, you're essentially downshifting the nervous system. The data point to magnesium's role in modulating C-reactive protein levels over time. Now, I want to be very clear about this. We're not talking about an overnight transformation. What we're seeing in the literature is that consistent evening magnesium supplementation, particularly the glycinate form, correlates with healthier inflammatory patterns measured through CRP. And so, by timing this around 10 p.m., you're working with your body's natural cortisol decline rather than against it. The second step is what I call the botanical flush, and this is where we leverage specific plant compounds that have been studied for their effects on the nervous system. Now, some of you might be wondering why I'm focusing on botanicals rather than pharmaceutical interventions. The mechanism by which this works is through gentle modulation rather than sedation. We're talking about passion flower and valerian root, and these are not sleep aids in the traditional sense. Passion flower operates through GABA modulation as well, but what's really interesting is its effect on cognitive arousal. What we know from the literature is that passion flower reduces the kind of mental chatter, that rumination, that keeps your stress physiology activated even when you're lying in bed. Valerian root works synergistically here. The data suggests that valerian affects GABAergic pathways through a slightly different mechanism, creating what I call a complementary calming effect. Now, I want to be very clear, individual responses vary significantly. Start with conservative doses, perhaps 200 to 300 milligrams of passion flower and 300 to 500 milligrams of valerian root, taken about 30 to 45 minutes before your target sleep time. What you're creating here is a physiological downshift that allows your inflammatory tone to reset. The third step addresses what I consider one of the most underappreciated aspects of evening inflammation management: light exposure. And here's why this matters so much. Blue light exposure after sunset, and especially after 9 p.m., delays melatonin release. Now, melatonin isn't just a sleep hormone. What's fascinating here is that melatonin has direct anti-inflammatory properties. When blue light delays melatonin, you're essentially extending your body's inflammatory window into the night. The mechanism by which this works involves your suprachiasmatic nucleus, your brain's master clock, which receives direct input from light-sensing cells in your eyes. And so, what I recommend is implementing what I call an amber lighting protocol. This means switching to amber or red spectrum lighting 1 to 2 hours before your 10 p.m. reset window. The data point to amber light having minimal impact on melatonin suppression compared to blue or white light. You're essentially telling your circadian system that it's time to transition into recovery mode. Some of you might be wondering about screens and devices. If you must use them, use blue light filtering applications. or amber-tinted glasses. What you're doing here is removing the signal that tells your brain it's still daytime. Now, let me explain what's actually happening at the cellular level during this 10 p.m. window, because understanding the mechanism makes the protocol far more actionable. Your inflammatory markers, particularly cytokines like IL-6 and TNF-alpha, follow a circadian pattern. What we know from the literature is that these markers should naturally decline in the evening as cortisol drops and melatonin rises. But here's the key thing. When your evening routine disrupts this pattern through stress, light exposure, or poor nutrient timing, you maintain what's called a pro-inflammatory state through the night. And so, what this three-step protocol does is create a coordinated intervention at multiple levels. The magnesium is working on your GABAergic system and modulating stress-responsive pathways that influence CRP. The botanicals are reducing cognitive and physiological arousal that would otherwise keep inflammatory signaling active. And the circadian reset through light management is optimizing melatonin release, which has its own anti-inflammatory cascade. What's really interesting is that these interventions are synergistic. The data suggests that combining these approaches creates a more robust effect than any single intervention alone. You're essentially stacking mechanisms that all converge on the same goal, reducing nighttime inflammatory tone and optimizing recovery. Let me walk you through how to implement this as a complete protocol. Starting at around 8:30 p.m., you're going to switch your lighting to amber spectrum. At 9:00 p.m., take your first staggered dose of magnesium glycinate, approximately 200 milligrams. At 9:30 p.m., prepare your botanical flush. Passion flower and valerian root as a tea or in capsule form. And then at 10:00 p.m., take your second magnesium dose, another 200 milligrams, and ensure all blue light sources are eliminated. What you're creating is a ritualized sequence that your nervous system begins to anticipate and respond to. The key thing to understand is consistency. Your circadian system and inflammatory markers respond to pattern recognition. When you implement this protocol at the same time each evening, you're training your physiology to enter this recovery state more efficiently. And so, what I've shared with you today is a three-step protocol. Magnesium. Staggering to support GABAergic tone and modulate inflammatory markers. The botanical flush using passion flower and valerian root to reduce physiological and cognitive arousal, and the circadian reset through amber lighting to optimize melatonin release and reduce nighttime inflammatory signaling. These aren't isolated interventions. They're a coordinated approach to leveraging your body's natural 10 p.m. biological pivot point. These aren't isolated interventions. They're a coordinated approach to leveraging your body's natural 10 p.m. biological pivot point. If you found this protocol valuable and want more science-backed apothecary routines, subscribe to this channel. I release new protocols weekly, all grounded in practical wellness science and designed for your daily routine.